Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's webinar. I'm your host, Dr. Jed Appleruth. We're going to be talking tonight about test optional, what it means, how it might affect your students, and this new world of test optional admissions, things you may have heard, things that are accurate. We're going to wait a minute while the room fills up. I see people are still coming in, and once we hit our plateau, we will jump right in. Just want to give people time. A note for tonight, we're going to record this session, so we will send you a copy of the recording, most likely early next week, probably Monday, once we render it and get it ready for submission. So also tonight, we're going to have time at the end for questions and answers. If you want, please, during the course of tonight's webinar, you can add your questions to the Q&A window. But I hope that over the course of the slide presentation, I'll answer most of the questions, but then for sure, afterwards, we'll have time for all the other ones it opens up. So I think we're starting to hit our plateau here. Now, why don't we jump in and begin talking about test optional admissions and what it means. All right, let us begin. And there we go. All right, so as many of you already know, the new world of college admissions is predominantly a test optional world. This is very different than before the pandemic. Test optional was not the dominant position for the vast majority of selective, very competitive colleges. But when kids couldn't get testing and they couldn't take the SAT or ACT because of the pandemic, school said, we're going optional. And that has endured. So that is one enduring change that took place because of the pandemic, that is massive move towards a test optional landscape. Now, it's important to understand that although tests are not required, there are many, many things that are not required. Taking AP classes is optional. Showing interest to a college, that's also optional. Going for leadership positions, in your school, optional. Getting good grades, optional. There are many things that are not required, but if you have them on the transcript, they make a difference. So that's to say that even though tests are not required, so many things that factor into your decision of whether you're accepted or not are not requisite, not required. They're optional. So I think testing is in that category. So test optional, what it means is that if you have an application and there is no test score, it's a complete application. The same thing if you have an application and there are no AP classes, it's a complete application. They'll read it, they'll process it. However, they're going to look, if there are test scores, they're going to be considered. If there are AP scores, they're going to be considered. It becomes a factor in the application. So there are 1,800 plus schools this year who are test optional. And that's the vast majority, up from about 1,000 before the pandemic. So that's kind of how things have shifted so quickly. And we anticipate that test optional is here to stay. We don't think the vast majority of schools are going to go back. We've seen a couple schools going back. We saw MIT and Georgetown and Purdue and Georgia Tech, but it's been a trickle, not a gusher. And we're actually all waiting with bated breath to figure out what the Supreme Court does with affirmative action. That's coming by June 30th, by next Friday. And in the event they do what everyone expects they're going to do in terms of with affirmative action, it may become harder to become and stay test required. That may be a little bit more challenging if you have the goal of maintaining diversity and affirmative action is made illegal for college admissions. So we're going to see how this plays out. But most likely, the vast majority of schools are not going to be test required going forward. So there have been some surveys, and some of these are actually outdated at this point. But ultimately, everyone says we're pretty much going to be sticking with this policy. There are some schools who are still waiting for more data. And they said, well, we've had a couple of years of data of admissions for kids who applied with test scores, without test scores. And we know what happened with applications. More kids sent more applications. Different kinds of kids submitted applications than before. But the whole thing is the outputs of what happens over the course of the 4 years. Are there differences between those groups of test score submitters and non-submitters in terms of GPA over 4 years, in terms of major selection, in terms of graduation rates over 4 and 6 years? And so schools are looking at that and seeing, are there differences? Do they make a difference? There are some schools who are saying, you know what, we have not seen a difference in terms of our kids with scores, without scores. Other schools say, you know what, test scores are actually a major predictor of performance. And so that was one of MIT's rationale. They said the kids without test scores, the kids with low test scores typically are the ones who don't succeed at MIT. Therefore, we're going to require test scores to make sure that all kids have a certain threshold level of math ability for our school in particular. So there are differences in terms of why schools would keep or not keep test scores required. So when schools go test optional, what happens? Well, one of the most basic things is schools are selective, where many kids are applying for a few spots. When you say test scores are now optional, more kids who would have opted out of that pool submit their applications. So therefore, the schools become naturally more selective, more desirable. And then part of it then becomes, as the schools, they were admitting 20, 1 in 5 students, but now they're admitting 1 in 10 students. Then kids feel like, well, I have to apply to more schools, and therefore that further drives schools to have more applications and lower rates of acceptance. So there's a bit of thing that happens here. Now, when you go test optional, colleges also have the ability to bring in students who before they wouldn't have been able to bring in, because schools are always watching their average GPA for the freshman class or average test score threshold. And if you're going to bring in a kid with very, very low test scores, the question is, what was that kid going to do to your, bring to your school? Because we're taking a hit on testing, but now that test score gets wiped out. So it's much easier to bring that kid in for a variety of reasons. If there's something that the school wants that the student has, that makes it much more easy to build their class as they want to build it. Additionally, that when you go test optional, you effectively wipe out the bottom quarter of kids with low test scores, which means your average test score for kids who submit goes up by about 30 points. And that's been shown in research for going back about a decade. And so that's one thing you get also. So you get more kids to apply, you become more selective, you're able to build the class you want, and also your average test score increases. For that reason, many colleges who are now test optional are going to stay for all of these nice things that they get. One thing, however, that you lose data. We're losing data. There was often, in terms of whether to give offers to kids or not, test scores are often a good predictor of yield. If given an offer, would a kid come to our school? Because let's say a student had a 1450 on the SAT, and this college, the average test score for kids who actually matriculate and go to the school was a 1480. So that kid has a pretty good chance you're kind of in the range. If, however, that kid had a 1450 and the average test score for that freshman class was a 1250, there's a good chance that that student is looking at this school as a backup and is going to be trying to go to a school a little higher in the pecking order. So they know they're going to probably have a lower chance of yielding that student with that higher test score. But now when test scores get wiped out, it's harder for colleges to predict yield, who will actually come. And for that reason, colleges are keeping bigger wait lists, and there's more variability. They have to give out more offers to get enough kids who actually say yes to the offer of admission. So yield has been imbalanced because of test optional admissions. So that's something, and also because we know that the test score ranges are a little bit skewed, and we're not sure where the new center is totally, because things have shifted up, and often they're kind of staying. There's some gravity there to keep it where they are. So we know that app numbers increase. I'll show you a few data points. Like NYU was a big one; they popped 30%. UCLA popped 40%. Some of the big state schools. Colgate more than doubled their take when the optional admissions went. And selectives, they became more selective. NYU really increased. Williams, MIT almost at half. Emory keeps driving down. Duke went from 11% to 4%. So we see that, holy cow, so many kids who wanted to go to Duke but said, I don't have the scores for it. When it's optional testing, they're like, well, I have good grades, off you go. And the challenge, though, is good grades are not as rare as they used to be. There's been a pretty stable trend of grade inflation over the past 3 decades. And now you have a lot more kids who have A's. And I've heard some admissions officers talk about A's are not as special. And the question is A's in what kind of classes and what kind of A's? High A's in APs, because a lot of kids have A's now. But test scores are still there. Look at Northeastern. They really blew up. They were at 20% acceptance rate, and now they're about 6%. So pretty amazing across the board what happened with the pandemic. And so the selectives are now very selective. That's a big change. So there are 4 primary policies, or there were before the pandemic: test required, optional, test blind, and flexible. We're seeing a lot less test flexible. That used to be a thing where You could send, a certain number of SAT subject tests, which now don't exist. You could, or an AP exam, or you need a math, but many of the schools who are test flexible are now test optional. And that really is the dominant position. Test required, though, still out there, and so is test blind. And there are more test blind schools. We'll talk about that in a minute. So test required, those schools, that's the military academies. That's all the Florida publics. That's Georgia Tech and UGA. That's MIT and Georgetown and Purdue, Tennessee, a few others. Without test scores, you can't go into the school. They need a test score. And so that is a very rare position. It used to be the majority position for many, many years. So here are some of the schools where it's required, some of the publics. Now, there is interest among the Southern schools. Both UNC Chapel Hill and UT Austin, they both put out announcements saying they were going back to test required, but then they retracted them and said, we need more time, a couple more years. But there's a move, you see it's in the South. And one of our colleagues, Rick Clark, said the South, there have been discussions at South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Virginia, to go back to testing. And there really is a push in that direction. Although, again, everybody's watching the Supreme Court and what they're going to bring down between now and the 30th. Could be next Thursday, next Friday. They often release their big, verdicts on Thursday. So it could be next Thursday this news comes down, and that'll be, I'm sure, front page on everywhere. So that's a big deal. So I mentioned the South may be going back to test required, but again, depending on what happens with SCOTUS and Supreme Court. So Georgetown, MIT, Purdue. MIT said, yeah, without test scores, we can't predict who will do well, because kids typically who had lower test scores are the ones who failed out and transferred out of MIT. So we want to see test scores to make sure the kids we let in have the math chops to hang here, because it's a very challenging, rigorous math curriculum. And we know that there are different grading cultures. There are some kids who have an A in calculus, but then take an AP Calc and an exam and get a 1. So yeah, by the standards of their high school, they're in the top, they have an A. By a standardized assessment, at a national level, they are not passing. So that's why you need something standardized. It's helpful, especially when there's a great deal of rigor at the college level. That's MIT's rationale. And in similar fashion, Jeremiah Quinlan over at Yale said, yeah, our best predictor of who does well at Yale, test scores, more than high school grades, more than academic rigor is test scores. And so that's really a big deal. And so there are schools, some of them give announcements, and you get a sense of how their admissions office views testing. And some of them like it a lot. Some of them are more suspect. Some of them, they moved away from it entirely. So there's definitely a pretty big range. I mentioned these are the schools that are required, a very small number. In the SCOTUS case, we are waiting. It's going to come down within the next, 8 days, most likely. There are schools where testing is required given lower GPAs. That at Auburn, if you have a 3.6, testing is optional. But though the language is, while we encourage students, so we actively encourage them to give us their testing, they're not required. But if you have a 3.6, it's optional. If you have a 3.59, test scores are required. So that's where there's a conditional optional piece. And there are more schools we think will maybe be doing this, depending what happens with the next 8 days, of course. Then test flexible is really not that popular. It was a bigger deal before the pandemic, but almost all the schools like NYU and Colorado College, other ones, it was test flexible, and now it's test optional. So that's kind of a very minority position. However, there is a perception out there that if you don't have an SAT score or an ACT score, then other testing becomes more important, such as APs or IB exams. So if I have 4s and 5s on the APs, in some ways they may be able to stand in, because again, it's standardized. Getting a 5 on AP Physics, a 5 on Calc, BC Calc, that says something about my level of ability on a national level. The same as having a 750 math says something very similar about you're in the top 1% of the country on a standardized measure. So for some kids where they don't have ACT scores or ST scores, their APs may be elevated to a higher level in committee, looking at what can we measure and compare with other kids. Cornell was very clear when they first announced they were going optional, that if you don't have test scores, we're going to look at other pieces with more scrutiny. And your GPA, your rigor, other testing, these all become more important in the absent that standardized test score, which makes sense. And so there are schools who are test blind. The new branding is called test free, but it's there, they won't look at them. So if you have a 36 it's not going to be factored in whatsoever. The majority of them are in California, but half of them are from UC and Cal State. 17 schools are piloting test blind, they're trying it out. So that's 3% of schools in the country are applying to testing. That's a meaningful number, but still it's the minority position. And we haven't seen this massive flood of schools join the train. When UC, then Cal State say we're test blind, we didn't, Washington State, but there really haven't been the flood of other schools because, and there are many schools who've been test optional for decades, like Bates and Bowdoin for 30, 40, 50 years. So it's not really new, but still they want to have the option that if there's a kid from an underrepresented community, first gen kid with great test scores, why would they say we're blind to that score? Because it may be that, this kid really shines and stands out and has a real gift with testing. And why are we going to discount that? Because all the research shows you're getting different pieces of information. High school GPA correlates with college GPA, but so does testing. And they're not totally overlapping or collinear. They're actually giving independent and informational bits. And if you combine them, it's additive to get a better prediction of how kids will do if you have both pieces of data. So saying we're blind to it, it's like, why not, optional kind of gets you there where I can look at it or not look at it, but blind says, even if your testing is amazing, we don't care. That's really a small number of schools doing that. The big ones, again, UCLA, like, the UCs and the Cal State. But then there are mostly smaller schools, Reed and Boise and Pitzer. Caltech is a bigger school and they're piloting it. It's funny because MIT is very similar to Caltech. MIT is not test required. I think it's now test blind for the minute. So it's interesting how that plays out. Other small schools, Northern Illinois, there's Catholic, there's St. Mary's. Worcester Poly is a good STEM school, and they're doing an 8-year pilot. Most likely they're going to stick with it from discussions with, hearing their head up of admissions and so forth. Now, we talked about this, that test optional, test blind aren't the same thing, that if you have a strong test score, it can make a difference. It can be a very meaningful plus factor in your application. It can also affect your merit-based aid. So there are colleges who give merit-based aid based on your grades and test scores. So having strong test scores and strong grades can yield financial, rewards for your student. Alabama is one of the schools that's always very generous. They give over $108 million, in terms of merit-based aid, and they have transformed their school. Their academic level of their student body has blown up, and they have so many kids now with all A's and strong testing because they're giving these massive merit-based awards. It's not need-based, and so they're pulling kids who would have gone to Cornell down to Bama because it's free. I could pay 80 grand a year for 320, or I could get totally free tuition. That's a big deal. I have a niece out of Richmond, and she got a 1390 on the SAT. She applied to a number of schools. She applied to Alabama, and given her a 3.5 GPA and her 1390, they awarded her the UA Scholar, which means tuition from Richmond went from $30,000 a year down to $6,000 a year. So they said, we're gonna lop off $96,000 for your test score. That's a big deal. So she's, her testing went to Alabama. It went to Georgia, where she was accepted. It went to South Carolina. She didn't send it, however, to Tulane, because the Tulane rep said, we don't want to see any scores under a 1430. And she abided by that counsel, and she was accepted. She got into Tulane, and they actually gave her a small bit of merit-based aid. So again, when you have a test score, it's going to help you at some places, and then other places, it's not going to help you. And part of it's listening, looking at their profiles, looking where your score fits in their score range. Other schools with merit scholarships, Utah State, Texas Tech. And part of it is you can look at the school's website or Google, or send a message to the admissions office. Do you have any merit-based scholarships? What are the criteria? And there are definitely schools where testing is part of that criteria. I live in Atlanta, and the Zell Miller Scholarship is an amazing scholarship. Given a 3.7 GPA and given a 1200 or a 3 or a 26 on the ACT, you get free tuition at the Georgia schools, which is really a big deal. And so there are many kids who are applying and going to Georgia. And part of the important thing is to keep it, to maintain that college GPA of 3.3. If you go under that, you lose the Zell. And I've seen kids try to claw it back after a year, because free tuition is really an amazing thing for kids. So the question becomes, when I have a test score, do I want to send it? The majority of kids will take a test in the country and figure out, is my test score strong enough? Should I prep? Should I put in more energy? Should I send my test score or not? And you only want to send strong test scores. You never want to send a weak test score. It's not going to help you. And so if you are below profile on testing, you don't typically want to send that test score. You want to only send things, it's optional. It's the same thing as you wouldn't send a 1 or a 2 on an AP exam. That's for your information only. I would send a 4 or 5 every time, a 3 depends. But you want to send things which strengthen. The same thing as, you wouldn't send, if you did an activity for 2 months, 9th grade and stopped, that's probably not going to go on your, your activities list. If you're choosing 10, and if you didn't follow through with it, that's not going to really impress the college as much. So you choose what you send as you're building your transcript, and you're trying to, pitch. These are my strengths. Always go with your strengths. So the whole thing of, how many kids are sending test scores, and then it doesn't matter. The submission rates are down to, in the mid 40s. There are more STEM kids send their testing, which translates to more male kids right now. But STEM is definitely a thing where kids want to showcase their math skills. They're strong, they're 750 on their math, is a way to showcase, yeah, I have A's in calculus, but also I did very well on a standardized test, and also I got a 4 or 5 on BC calculus. All these things are telling a story about my level of math ability. Now it matters whether the school is selective or less selective. Where schools are more selective, more kids send test scores. And one of the ways you can find this out, you can go on the common data set. You can Google common data set for any school. And I think it's under C9 for application. It'll tell you what % of kids send test scores. And the schools that are tougher, the Dukes and the Cornells and the MITs, they have, now they're required, but much higher rates of kids sending test scores than schools that are less selective. And so that is something that the Common App found as well, that schools are more selective, both the public, like the UVAs and the Michigan and Texas, more kids send test scores because they're trying to compete in a crowded field. And any way I can stand out, I'm going to try to when they're taking relatively so few students. So as the school becomes more selective, more kids send test scores. And then kids are strategic in their score submission. Like my niece had her 1390. She was applying to 8 schools. That score went to 5 schools and didn't go to 3 of them, because like the Tulane, where that 1390, UNC Chapel Hill, that was under their threshold. UVA, that was later, so it didn't go to UVA, but it went to USC. Didn't go to, but it went to UGA. And so it's important to know that. And there are many more kids who are being strategic. So my 1270 on the SAT, that's great here, helps me here, hurts me here. Therefore, I send here, I withhold it here. On the Common App, you get to choose whether or not you send it to each school. And also, we mentioned that when it comes to major, it matters. So a lot more engineers are having their test score sent because they want to showcase, yeah, I got a 33 in math. Also, more kids applying to business majors want to showcase their STEM scores, but far fewer kids, those applying to gen education or social work or history, they're not sending their test scores to the same level. It really is more the STEM kids where those math scores loom larger. Okay, let's get that one. So one of the biggest questions parents ask is, does it help? How do we know? Now, we know there are admissions offices where they like testing and they're transparent about it. One of them is Boston College. BC, look at the numbers. The numbers tell a very clear story. You had 17,000 kids apply with tests. Of those, 5,000 got in for an admit rate around 30%. Then you have 23,000 kids apply without tests. They let in only 2,500 of those kids, which is an admit rate closer to 10%. So it's almost 3x that they are really looking at test scores and saying, this is important to us in BC. Now, one important caveat that the 3x difference is not purely because of the test score. There's something called collinearity, or essentially it's correlation, that kids who send test scores typically have strong test scores. Kids with strong test scores typically have more rigorous course taking and higher GPAs. So part of it is it's not an apples to apples comparison. However, the causality piece, the causal thing is if I have 2 kids from the same high school, let's say, who have very similar course taking, similar GPA, one of them sends a 1450 to BC, and one of them sends no testing whatsoever. Is the kid with that 1450 going to get in at a higher rate? Most likely, yes. But it's, it's the whole thing is how much more. So is it a 30% higher acceptance rate because of the testing, or 40? We can't ever tease out with any kind of confidence, what portion is due to the collinearity, which is better GPAs, more rigor, what portion is due to that test score. But I've talked to enough admissions officers who tell me when we have kids who look very similar academically, and one has really strong testing, that strong testing is a plus factor without question. So it is part of the equation. Here are a number of schools who we have found their data. We backed it out often like by putting together an announcement and then a thing on their website, and we have to back out these admission rates. But you can see like UVA actually is bigger this year. It's essentially double. So and UVA, if they went test required, I wouldn't be surprised by their data. Notre Dame, the kids getting in with testing, it's double. BC, it's almost 3x. Fordham is a smaller. So here, Fordham, they're not putting the same priority on testing, let's say, as Notre Dame. Same thing as Tufts. If there's an advantage, not as big. Same thing, Barnard Wellesley is almost double. Emory, it's about double. Colgate's more than double. So again, you can see kind of teasing out their philosophies of which schools tend to put more of a focus on testing. But this is not public. It's not captured in the common data set. They don't often broadcast this, but we are able to back this out and capture the data. So it's interesting, but there's not as much transparency. They want everyone to apply. And if everyone understood that testing really mattered so much, then some of the kids without testing maybe wouldn't apply. So they want everyone to apply. But here you can see that there are differential rates of admission. All right, so the question is, should I send my scores knowing all this? Well, before you do anything, get your baseline. At Apple Ruth, we help students get their baseline tests. We administer SATs and ACTs. And now there's, the new wrinkle is the digital SAT, which is coming. It's coming for the October PSAT, and then it'll be here in March. The last paper SAT is December. So if you're going to be a rising junior, you're trying to figure out, you might throw in and get a baseline for the digital test using the College Board's Blue Book app, which you can download whenever you want. It's available today for download. Just type in College Board or Blue Book, and then there's a download the application. But you want to, before you do any test preparation, any work, get your baseline tests. And then look, okay, I'm looking at these 4 or 5 schools, 6 schools I know I'm looking at in my list. And if I come out and I'm looking at schools, they want a 33, and I open up with a baseline practice test of a 29, okay, I'm 4 points away. That's within striking distance. If, however, I'm looking at these schools where I'm looking at average test scores of 33, 32, and my opening test scores of 20, 22, 21, that's a big hill to climb. Is it worth my energy and effort putting in all the work and the time and the resources if I'm that far away, that far moved? And probably for that kid, I focus on other things, on the essay, on activities, but I may not, unless there's going to be some schools on my list where if I can get up to a 26, that would be compelling. But if all the schools on my list are these super competitive top schools because of my great grades and rigor, I may not put in the energy and effort and resources for testing. But for a lot of kids who are looking and they're in the range of, I have a 27, I need to kind of get a 30, 31. Yeah, for sure you can. That's our average kid goes up 4 or 5 points in ACT. So it's not a massive lift. So it's getting a sense of how close am I. And then the question is, do you want the scores to be seen? Are they going to add value and strengthen the application? And for STEM and business, one of our colleagues, Jess Selingo, said, yeah, for STEM and business kids, having strong math scores leads to higher rates of acceptance. One of our colleagues, Sean Felton over at Cornell, said, you know what? Test scores, they matter by major. So if you're a fine arts major, they're going to factor less, classical music major, somewhere where it's about your portfolio, your audition. But other majors, pre-business or engineering or other things, yeah, that can have more weight. And then Rick Clark, colleague of ours, friend over at Tech, said, if you're in the top half, send it. If you're in the bottom quartile, I probably wouldn't send it. If you're in that third quartile, then it depends. Do you think it's going to strengthen? And that's where there's a question about that. And now if your grades are like amazingly good grades, great rigor, only modest testing, do I want to bring, would the testing muddy the water? The whole thing is trying to frame the conversation. Do I want to have the conversation be like, wow, 3.9, all this, all these APs versus, and a 1220 versus let's just focus on the great academics and the grades and rigor versus I have a 3.6, I have 5 APs, but I have a 1420. Then do I want that score in the mix? Yes, I do. So it's getting a sense of where my grades are compared to my testing. And if one's way ahead, I want to send things that strengthen, not distract from. That's the key. So the choice really is yours. The other thing is individual scores matter. If I'm applying to let's say my test score is in the bottom half of for that school, but I'm applying to be an engineer and I have a 780 in there. Let's say I did 620 on verbal, but I have a 780 math. I'd probably send it even though my composite score is below their top half, because I want to make sure that they see that my math is a 780, even though I'm lower because of that lower verbal. And conversely, I'm applying to a language arts program, history program, and I have a weaker math, but I have a 790 in verbal. I want to make sure that that's conveyed and communicated, that I have really strong verbal skills. All right, and be thoughtful. Don't ever send a score that's weak, because they can't unsee it and it becomes part of the conversation. Don't ever send in a 1 on an AP exam, and don't send a very low test score just to have it on the transcript. Send things that strengthen. That's the key. Treat every school differently. You get to choose every single application. Do I send scores or not? And be thoughtful and look at their numbers. Here's an example, like a Swarthmore. They're middle 50 for kids who get into Swarthmore and actually matriculate. It's between a 1380 and 1540. So if I get a score, the whole thing is, do I submit it? Now, if I have a score over 1470, send it. That's a good score. It'll strengthen. If I have a score below a 1380, in almost all cases, I wouldn't send it. The only times I would are if you are like a first-gen student, or you come from a place where, let's say you're coming from West Virginia and in some really rural county where the average test score at your high school is 1050, and you have a 1360. And so you are shining way above your peers and cohort. In that case, that's still, and they want to admit kids from your county. So I think that's where the score may be a differentiator. But in most cases, if you're a straight academic kid, there's no real hook, there's no first gen, there's no special place or diversity component, a 1350 I would keep to myself. I go with the merits of my grades and my rigor and so forth. The third quartile is where it's a little trickier, because I have a 1460, I'm more inclined to send that score than if I had a 1390. And also looking at my grades, again, do I have a 3.9, a bunch of rigor, and a 1400? Maybe I wouldn't send to Swarthmore, versus I have a 3.5, but a 1440, I probably send it. And also, is there a really strong math score in there that I want to make sure they see if I'm applying to a STEM program? So that's part of the calculus. And again, every school is different. So you build your spreadsheet, look at your scores, and go through it and say, send, don't send, send, don't send, down the line. One thing that's meaningful is that test scores post-pandemic have increased around 30 points, which is, there's research that this is pretty normal, because you're wiping out the bottom quarter of kids with lower scores. And we see Emory, they popped around 30, 40 points. Colgate popped. All these schools, their average test score increased a little bit for the most part. Tulane popped a little bit, Michigan. And so that's just part of the pandemic effect. And then going test optional. So that is a ongoing thing. And at Appleruth, one of our key tenets, we like to work on our kids, help them believe in themselves, their testing ability. We do 3 things at Appleruth: academic tutoring, test preparation, and we help coach kids on using their resources. Peter, I'm going to cue you to just give a little poll. Everyone, it'll take you about 30 seconds. Just let me know, are you a student? Are you a parent? Are you an educator? If so, where are you in the process? Are you a high school junior, senior, sophomore, freshman? Those 3 things that we do, if any of them interest you, and if so, do you want someone to reach out to you? And then that's it. You can close it. That's all. And then those are my questions for you. And now I want to open this thing up and ask for your Q&A. So everyone take a minute. We have plenty of time today, and I really saved a lot of time for Q&A. So anything I haven't answered about testing, test optional, go ahead and type it in. I like when there's a nice, rich Q&A session. So if I didn't answer a question, load it up now. I will answer it. All right. So first question is already in. Based on the need for something standardized in the absence of the ACT, ST scores, is it wise to send a 3 on an AP test to make it clear it wasn't a 2 or a 1? So there is a discrepancy. There is a open debate among admissions officers about that 3 issue. Everyone knows, don't send your 1s or 2s. Everyone knows, send your 4s and 5s. The 3, what I would look at is the consensus view. I've seen some people say send your 3s, but typically it is look at the college. Do they give credit for a 3? If they give credit for a 3, then a 3 is something I want them to see. If they give, like, for, let's say I took AB calculus. And then I applied to Penn. Penn only gave credit for a 5. And so they didn't take a 4 or below. Would I send my 3 on the AB Calc? I wouldn't send my 3. I didn't have the score. But for UGA, a 3 gives you credit. For Northeastern, a 3 may give you. So for certain schools, it would depend upon the school. Is Google, AP credit, cutoffs, thresholds for a given college, and that'll help you figure out, do I send that 3 or not? I think some good advice. Although again, there are 2,500 schools in different offices will tell you different things. That's, I think, the consensus that 3 depends upon the academic level of the school and if they give credit. Are you going to share the recording, please? I am driving my car and the internet signal is not strong. Yes, we are going to send you a copy of this probably Monday, maybe Tuesday. You'll have a copy. You can watch it, review it, look at the slides, share it for sure. All right. Could you pull up the slide with the colleges that are test required as of right now? Well, I can just knock it off. There aren't that many. The Florida Publics. So Go Gators, University of Florida, FSU, all FNAM, all the schools in the Florida system are tied. They tie their scholarships to testing, and so they're all test required. That's Florida. In Georgia, it's our flagships. It's Georgia Tech, which is an amazing school, and UGA. Those are test required. Tennessee is their flagship state school. Purdue, MIT, Georgetown, the military academies, Coast Guard, Annapolis, West Point, Air Force, and Colorado. So all, that's honestly, those are the main ones. And there's some other ones, but those are the selective schools that are on our radar right now. And then the conditional ones like Auburn, if you have under a 3.6 and so forth. So that really is it. So test required is a very small number, although there are a number of public schools, especially the UNCs, and they put forth an announcement, we're going back, and they retracted for another year. Texas, Virginia. I wouldn't be surprised if some of the big state schools looking at these massive applicant pools, which are very diverse, if they don't go back to testing. But again, we're all watching to figure out what happens with the court. That will affect things for sure. All right, you mentioned APs, but not college classes for students who are dual enrolled. How are college classes weighted in comparison to AP classes? So you're getting credit for academic rigor for an AP class or for dual enrollment if you're taking it at college level. And so I think, and typically, the counsel is take your APs first at your high school. Once you've maxed those out, go do dual enrollment. If you want to do differential equations and calculus, they don't offer that in your AP. Go ahead and take it at the local community college, but they definitely give you strong credit for an IB class, an AP class, and a dual enrollment college class. So yeah, those are all factored in for the academic rigor of the application. All right, target schools admit kids with an ACT range of 32 to 35. That's the mid-50 range. We have a 32, all A's of strong rigor. Would a 32 hurt? No. If you're in the mid-50 range, I think a 32, looking at the range, is not going to hurt. Again, you could ask, there is a debate here, and it may depend upon the school and the school's philosophy. So some admission officers say, I want to see a 33, 34. For sure you're in that range. Some say if you're in the range, submit it. Part of it, you have good A's in rigor. So this is one of those, it's a little bit interesting with this one. You might, talk to your school counselor. What are they seeing? What do they want from your high school? Getting a sense of who's getting accepted and with what test scores. That may be a factor to kind of get more specific to your zip code and where you live and your high school. But it's one of those, it depends. If it was a 31, I would say don't send it. But the 32, if it was a 34, 33, but 32 is kind of, you're right on the fence. So I would say you may get a couple opinions on this one. But I don't think, my personal opinion is a 32 going to hurt. It does show a certain level, a certain threshold of skill. But if this is Princeton, do I want to send that? And there, some of them may have made some kind of comment to your school or your counselor in terms of the kind of schools they want to see, the kind of scores they want to see. Because we heard like a Tulane rep say, yeah, I don't want under a 1390, even though that was within range. They're like, I don't want anything under 1430. Sometimes schools are on, they actually are more explicit with that. Okay. What is a good ACT score for UGA? The mid 50 range for Georgia, it's like a 30, 31. What I would do is, again, you can go on college, the Big Futures, it's a College Board site, type in UGA applying testing, it'll give you the range. Or if you want to go on the college's, UGA freshman profile, it'll give you the average test score or the common data set, and it'll tell you right then and there the range. But just off memory, I think it's around like a 31 and above, is in range, and like a little higher for Georgia Tech. But I would verify that and check that. It's a fast Google search. Take you about 20 seconds to get that data. All right, my daughter has a 4.4 junior year. Nice, 4.3 cumulative, all honors APs, tons of prep. All right, not a strong test taker. What do you advise? I'd say go with all honors and APs. How many APs? Are we talking like, are there a whole bunch, or is it like mostly honors and 2 APs? That matters some. But typically, if you have great rigor, great GPA, and your test scores are not on the level, typically I would say just ride the academic strength. I would probably withhold testing. If I would do a practice test, just get a sense of how close are we and look at the ranges for those colleges. But if it's a huge gap, I'm like 7-8 points away, that's going to be a big lift on the ACT, or 190 points off. That's a big lift, or 20. So I would say go ahead and look at the ranges and see where you're starting from before I make that calculus. Homeschoolers, should they always send this test scores? Homeschoolers are interesting because part of it, in terms of the grading culture, it's by no means standardized, and trying to get a sense of how this parent evaluates the student, because it's not uniformly assessed. And so anything you can give them that is standardized is beneficial. And so I think if you have good, decent testing, I would submit it for a homeschooler. And that's something often like international kids, some of them, they don't know exactly how to evaluate your high school. They don't, they track the high schools in the US, but all over the world, there may be a school they don't have data from. So a test score helps kind of ground the application for a lot of kids. When the data is missing, test scores help round things out. All right, dream school is Georgetown, which requires all test scores. How to mitigate this? Do all of our other accomplishments mitigate potentially lower scores? A 32 for G-Town. I would look at it. I would look at who's getting in, look at the range. You're saying it's on the lower side, and if testing is not strong, if she's currently at a 32, if you're not done, if you're going to be applying in the fall, applying early, there's still some time left. And honestly, I don't know how much you put in energy, resources, but getting a kid from a 32 to a 33, maybe even a 34, that's something that I see all the time. And so then suddenly you check the box and scoring is not going to be a liability. Georgetown likes test scores. And they were one of the first ones to reinstate the testing. And their language all along was, we want to see test scores. And so I think that of many schools, they definitely are in a different bucket, because they're so transparent that testing is important to them. So if I could bring it up to a 33, I would like to, just to make my application more competitive for a school at Georgetown, where the admissions office is pretty clear. Testing is part of their algorithm. I go to a private school where the rigorous students take 6 to 8 APs. I go to publics where they take 8 to 12. The colleges factor that in. Yes, they absolutely do. So kids applying, you're always being compared to your cohort. So if we have kids where there are no APs, and so there's no expectation to have any APs in the transcript. However, they are going to look at the levels of rigor as defined by the high school. Then there are some schools where, Stuyvesant or other places where the kids are taking 12 APs. And so, if you're taking only 2 or 3, you're going to be relatively weaker and bigger compared to your cohort. So they are always looking closely at you vis-a-vis your school. And with your application, they're going to send the school profile. And so it'll tell you the average number of APs, the average scoring on APs, testing, and so forth. And that accompanies your transcript is that high school profile. So they are looking at you in context, absolutely right. Would they allow superscoring between the current SAT and the digital? That remains to be seen. That's going to be decided on a school-by-school basis. We gave a talk again with Sean Felton, who said, we're treating these things the same. We're not going to discriminate. So Cornell is going to superscore across digital and paper-based, but there are not that many schools yet on record. And, these tests aren't going to come out until March. I think we're going to see a lot more schools giving their policies between now and obviously when kids apply, not this fall, the coming, but in a year. So we'll have more data, but I know some schools will and some schools will not. How about Notre Dame on the low end of the range? 32 ACT, strong grades and rigor otherwise. So Notre Dame, you know, I think I would look at the range, and I would also talk to the counselor, talk to your school, because it's going to vary in terms of, I need to see their range at 32 to 34. And I don't know, it's interesting in terms of, do you send it or do you withhold it? And I would look and get a sense from the you know, from your counselor for your school, what they want from your school, getting a sense of those bubble scores. They're on the range. If you're under that mid 50 percentile, typically withhold it. If you're right there, that becomes a question. Where can you find the percentage of admitted students who apply to optional? Because many colleges don't list it in the common data set. Yeah. Well, the percent of, actually, you know what? The common data set does tell you the number of kids, the percent of kids who submitted scores. So that is in the common data set under, I think it's like C8 or C9. And so you can find that data. So go to type in the word common data set 2022, Auburn, and it'll, you know, Princeton, Harvard, it'll show you the percent of kids who submitted scores for the SAT and the ACT. That is actually a requirement of the common data set to fill that data point out. So that should be helpful there. All right, does Barnard value test scores? Yeah, we showed earlier, I think that it was like 80% advantage for Barnard kids who submitted test scores. So it was, I think that was the number. I can go back a few slides, but yeah, Barnard seems to have, you know, the privilege to prioritize kids with strong testing. Okay, you haven't mentioned these activity strength at all, and they are of major consequence. Yes, and this for sure. I mean, part of, on a different talk, I talk about the college admissions process. This was really the myths of test optional, and academic activities matter. They do not, however, matter at the same level by any stretch as academic strength, because colleges do not want to let kids in who are not going to succeed. It hurts them tremendously if they get, if kids can't make it and they transfer out, if they fail out of schools, it hurts the school's ranking. So the best predictor of performance in college is performance in high school and also these tests. And so if you're not academically at the level in terms of your GPA, in terms of academic rigor, that trumps all the activities, with the exception of the kids who are D1 athletes and quarterbacks and people who are going to win games and, you know, be very impactful on the field, or they have something that the school really wants. But otherwise, activities, you know, if you Google NACAC factors for admission, activities are meaningful, but they're not nearly as meaningful as the academic solids are, and the grades and the rigor and even testing. And so, but they are important for, you know, establishing that you're going to bring something to the school. Colleges want to see that you have leadership and depth in one or two areas. They're looking at, you know, not, I did 10 clubs, they don't care about that, but I was really invested. I did one or two things with, you know, over multiple years, and I advanced to some level. Like I contributed, I participated, I was involved with, you know, some aspect of managing, leading, being deeply involved, versus I just showed up an hour a month. And they ask you how many hours on the common app. You know, it's like how many hours estimated, you know, per week, per month. How many months a year were you involved with this thing? So they want to find out that I do it 10 hours for the year, or no, this is my thing, I did it 10 hours a month. And so that's meaningful too. And did I rise to leadership somewhere? Am I going to bring that leadership to the college campus? So activities definitely matter, but they really matter after you've shown them that you can handle the work. Because if you can't handle the work, the activities really are not a major factor. Again, unless you have an amazing pitching arm or your quarterback, and you can win games in the field for the school and help their donations, and their more kids apply when they win games, which is a fact. So you help them in other ways if you don't have good test scores or good other things, good GPA. Are there any other questions? We've come to the end of my list. We have 10 minutes remaining if you all want to use that time. Anything I haven't answered? Okay, here we go. Do you do college consulting? My daughter is a rising junior in high school. We refer that to one of our partners. We have many partners in various markets. We have on the ground and online. And so all you have to do is email info@appleRoof and say, I came to a webinar and I'd like to request a strong college consulting referral. We know people, very, very strong consultants who we can refer you to. We can give you, several names. You can call them, find out who you like, and go from there. We definitely work with many of them for, like 15 plus years. Does the executive functioning coaching you offer help with college application process? It helps kids complete their assignments, help them manage, things that are coming, things that are due. So I would say yes. I work with students where I do EF, work with them on their high school side, but also if they promise that they're going to have these things due at these dates, we talk about, where it's going to fit, how you're going to do it, how you're going to do reminders, what's your process, who are you looking to help you edit, review it, how are you going to go get help? So definitely. So pretty much all the things on your plate become part of the conversation when it comes to executive functioning, of optimizing your time, your energy, your resources. So yes. Yeah, I love the EF coaching piece. I think it really helps kids. I just had one of my EF students today who's now in college, and he finished his semester at Northeastern. He's now essentially graduated from our time, but he's come so far from high school, scattered, behind, chaos, crazy, and now it's just on top of it and organized, using systems. So, and yeah, and almost all the work, the EF coaching is remote because they're short sessions. They're like, today we went for half an hour. Often my student, we go for 15 minutes, and they're short. So having a meeting in that duration wouldn't make that much sense. We log in, what's going on, what's priorities, energy, you talk to the teacher, what's, taking breaks, taking care of your body, when you're going to sleep, all this food, all the things. We kind of talk about the whole holistic experience of being a student and being a young person. And all that happens for my kids, it's all remote. And that really is, I think, very, very transferable, powerful work. All right, anything else? One more question. Are we wrapped up? Okay, well, I think that's all I got for right now. Everyone have a great night. And there'll be future webinars about the digital SAT, about EF coaching, all these things. There's one final question before we go. How much do senior grades count for a kid applying early? Very little. Your junior year, those are the big grades, because typically when you're applying early, that's by October, there aren't that many grades in. But if you're applying regular decision for those Jan 1st deadlines, yeah, those grades do count. But for your early applications, which will be many of your applications, it's your junior year and below. That really is where the action is. But definitely for those interim grades, keep them decent, but there's not much going out to the schools. So I hope that helps. All right, y'all, have a great night. Everybody be well. And if you need any help with, the test prep piece or academic work, EF coaching, please reach out to us. We're happy to help and get things started before the fall. All right, y'all, be well. Have a good night.